southwestern portion of the watershed, that's where the Santa Clara River Basin exists. Jeff, go ahead and next slide. And so you'll see on the map here on the right-hand side is the Los Angeles County portion, and then down in the southwest part, that brown colored area is the groundwater basin that the Santa Clarita Valley Groundwater Sustainability Agency was formed to oversee and develop a groundwater sustainability plan for. So the basin's in the southwest portion, and it drains into Ventura County, into the Piru side. And you'll notice Castaic Lake is just north of it. Pyramid Lake and Bouquet Reservoirs are further north and east. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about the groundwater basin itself, so that brown area in the slide I just showed you, boy, you know, we've got the natural river system that runs through it and tributary areas. Surrounding this area are different kinds of developed areas. You know, it's hard to live here without driving over either the main stem of the river or the tributaries throughout the day. The basin, though, is an important source of groundwater for the communities here. And it's not the only source, though. You know, in terms of municipal water delivery, roughly half the water delivered is from groundwater and the other half is from imported water. And it's been managed conjunctively for quite a long time and managed well. And Jeff will show some slides later that look at history that sort of paint that picture. But the point is, it's been managed well, and we haven't seen undesirable results that a lot of other basins in the state are seeing, so that's good. Nevertheless, we do have to form this required groundwater sustainability plan. What we're talking about today is a specific part of the plan, but it's a very important part of the plan called the Sustainable Management Criteria. And that includes a sustainability goal along with locally developed criteria that are set up to make sure that we maintain sustainability, or if there are issues that we eliminate things that could interfere with sustainability. You'll hear Jeff use the term undesirable result later. And so this plan maintains and improves sustainability over the 20-year implementation period that the Department of Water Resources has prescribed. Go ahead, Jeff. We have developed, with input from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, a sustainability goal that we think fits with the overall look or the overall understanding of our watershed. And this is one that's specific to the GSP. Take some time and read that. So this is the proposed goal. It may change some. We'll be interested to get your feedback at the latter part of our workshop today on it. And Tara and or Kathy will be facilitating that discussion, and we can talk about this goal in more detail then if you would like. But we think it wraps in the right components here. Okay, Jeff, go ahead. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to review some graphics. We're going to talk about where we are in the GSP development process. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Jeff will talk about what we've learned so far. We'll also cover the purpose of the sustainable management criteria, which is to avoid undesirable results. And we're also going to be talking about the process to develop the criteria. And there's a slide that we'll go to next. And then there's another slide that'll detail that out even better that Jeff will go through. And then Jeff is going to go in and provide a summary of each of the sustainability indicators. You know, the rules for developing this plan requires that we do that. And so we're happy to do that. And we'll talk about those today. Go ahead, Jeff. Okay. These are the activities that lead towards completing the groundwater sustainability plan. At the bottom is where we started. Stakeholder engagement has been going on for quite a while. We've had workshops that describe the basin setting. We've learned a ton about the basin as we've developed the plan, and we've shared that with stakeholders. Right now, we're in the planning phase where we're establishing the sustainable management criteria. We'll be moving on to projects and management actions. These are things that are also part of the GSP that make sure that we have the right kinds of projects and management actions to make sure that we reach sustainability. Monitoring is also an important component. And then later this year, we'll be releasing a draft groundwater sustainability plan for public review and bringing it to the board of directors towards the latter part of this year. And after board adoption, we begin implementing the GSP. Next slide, please. And Jeff, this is where I'll turn it over to you and let you keep going.
Great, thank you, Rick.
You're
All
welcome.
right, so what have we learned so far? As Rick mentioned, we've not seen undesirable results or undesirable effects. This is the key word or key set of words that DWR wants us to look at. If we do have undesirable results, that could mean that we have an unsustainable condition. We've not seen that for each of the indicators we have so far. Groundwater levels are highly variable in the basin, but they are stable over the long term, over many cycles of climate. The water budget analysis that we've presented previously indicates there's sufficient recharge into the basin, into the groundwater basin to balance pumping according to the operating plan now and into the future. Water quality has been impacted by contamination, as most of you know, in some places. The state regulatory agencies oversee investigation and cleanup of this contamination, and SCV has been proactively, implementing wellhead treatment as needed. River habitat in some locations is supported by groundwater, and so it's a really important part of this overall planning effort. However, it's been resilient to historic droughts, including the last one that we just went through. Avoiding undesirable results, particularly with GDEs, or you'll hear the term groundwater dependent ecosystems, as a result of pumping is critical. And we've established groundwater trigger levels and an evaluation process and some responses if we reach those trigger levels so that we can avoid impacts to those GDEs. So what's the purpose of sustainable management criteria? Well, avoiding undesirable results or undesirable effects. We want to provide criteria and thresholds for measuring and evaluating sustainability. We need some guideposts to help us know if we're on track or if we're off track. And we want to anticipate conditions that could lead to undesirable results as well in our planning process. So here's the process that we've been going through. I've shown this in the past. You can see there are a number of steps, starting with an understanding of the basin conditions, setting an initial sustainability goal, which Rick showed. We'll be revisiting that, trying to define what are undesirable results. What are those effects that we want to avoid? Then we start establishing these thresholds we've talked about, called minimum thresholds. Just to, for example, with water levels, how low do we want to see water levels go in the future with and without climate change? And the measurable objectives, which are kind of the goal, which create this operational range for water levels in the basin, both in the alluvial aquifer and in the deeper Saugus formation. We want to operate the basin in a manner that allows us to have enough water present in the aquifer to get through the next drought. If we see that we have an undesirable effect or an undesirable result, we would consider looking at projects and management actions, as you see on the right-hand side over here. That's only if needed. And we'll ask the question, if that's true, are those projects and management actions implementable? Are they affordable? Do the GSA members and the stakeholders in the basin support it? And if we feel that we need it, we'll go back, if we find that actually it's too expensive or there's something that's in the way of implementation of one of those projects and management actions, we'll go back and revisit our sustainability goal and our undesirable results and our thresholds to make any adjustments if needed. So it's a bit of an iterative process that we're expected to go through if we find that we have an undesirable result that isn't affordable, isn't implementable. All right, so how do we define undesirable results? The key here is that they must be significant and unreasonable. This is something that the stakeholders in the basin define. We've taken a shot at this and we're going to present some of that for you today. It's got to be caused by pumping, and it's got to affect the long-term sustainable groundwater production. It's going to affect other beneficial uses, including those groundwater-dependent ecosystems and threatened and endangered species that are present in the river system. We have an undesirable result if we exceed minimum threshold. These levels, these minimum levels in a specified number of representative wells that we're going to establish. And these criteria may be refined as we obtain more monitoring data and we do more analysis in the future. So what are some of the examples of undesirable results that we've considered for each of those indicators? So for chronic lowering of groundwater levels, for example, in the alluvial aquifer, the near surface aquifer, sand gravel, groundwater elevations that drop below the minimum thresholds in 25% of representative wells over a 2-year period. That's considered an undesirable result. We're also concerned about the rate or magnitude of water level decline. If it's a very rapid decline that we've not seen in the past or that we're not expecting based on our groundwater modeling, then if we see that in 25% of the representative wells over a 2-year period, that could also trigger an undesirable result. And of course, we're concerned about potential impacts to the groundwater dependent ecosystems as a result of water level changes in that alluvial aquifer, particularly as, where it's connected to the river. Next, we have this chronic reduction of groundwater and storage in that alluvial aquifer. That's the water that's present in the pore spaces in the sand and gravel. We want to maintain enough water in that unit, in that storage, to be able to get through an extended drought. And so if we see water level declines, and this is very related to water level changes, that we see are causing an undesirable result for water levels, it's going to cause an undesirable result for groundwater and storage. If we see that in 25% of the wells over a 2-year period, that's considered an undesirable result. Looking at the Saugus Formation for chronic lowering of groundwater levels. In this case, we've defined undesirable result as groundwater elevation having dropped below the minimum threshold in 3 consecutive years, and we've established a specific set of minimum thresholds in individual representative wells that are completed in the Saugus Formation. And for the alluvial aquifer and the Saugus Formation together, a reduction in groundwater and storage that results in an inability to meet demand during a multi-year drought, that's also an undesirable result. We're also required to look at land subsidence, especially that substantially interferes with surface land uses. So the undesirable result for subsidence is land surface deformation, causing broken pipelines or damaged roads, critical infrastructure impacts, and land impacts. And in case of subsidence, if pumping results in land subsidence and greater than the thresholds that we establish, at 10% of the monitoring locations, that's an undesirable result. For groundwater quality degradation, this is a list of the undesirable results, and I'll just briefly cover them. So water management actions, particularly those that are developed by the GSA that interfere with existing groundwater remediation efforts. That's potentially an undesirable result, particularly if it causes a permanent loss in groundwater supply. Concentrations of regulated contaminants in untreated groundwater from private, domestic, and agricultural wells exceed regulatory thresholds for the basin water quality standards. Significant and unreasonable loss of municipal groundwater supply due to migration of a contaminant plume and an inability to pump and treat groundwater, or reasonably secure an alternative water supply. That's an undesirable result. And then groundwater pumping strategies that cause concentrations of salts and nutrients, or these total dissolved solids, chloride, nitrate, sulfate, things that are dissolved in the water, that are naturally occurring in many cases. If they exceed water quality objectives, or somehow reduce what's called the basin-wide assimilative capacity for salts in the basin, that's an undesirable result. Those thresholds are described in the salt nutrient management that's already been adopted in the basin. And of course, if that happens, then that could impact the ability to distribute and use and develop a recycled water program if salts become an issue in the basin. So we have another indicator, depletion of interconnected surface water and impacts to GDEs. Our focus for this particular indicator as an undesirable result is really a permanent loss or significant degradation of existing native riparian or aquatic habitat due to lower groundwater levels caused by pumping. It could also be an acute temporary loss of aquatic habitat in specific locations, critical to sensitive aquatic species due to lower groundwater levels, again, caused by pumping. This is specifically referring to areas where we know the unarmored three-spine stickleback fish live. They're very sensitive to flow. So with that, I'm going to move into the sustainable management criteria thresholds that we've proposed and that are presented in the draft sustainable management criteria section of the GSB. It's now out for review. So what we propose for thresholds for chronic lowering of water levels at representative wells. Well, for the minimum threshold, and I'll show you a graphic that helps explain this. We've used our groundwater model for the basin, our calibrated model, to predict what the water level would be in the year 2042 and 2072 with climate change. We did that analysis, and as we presented previously, the basin is still sustainable at that level. And so we've set the minimum level at that predicted lowest level in 2042 in representative wells. Now, we put a note here because we're concerned about avoiding impacts to GDEs. And so if water levels go below historical levels in the alluvial aquifer as a result of groundwater pumping, that triggers an evaluation of the cause and may include management actions that avoid impacts to GDEs. Measurable objectives, and again, that's a level where we'd like to maintain water levels in the aquifer, in the alluvial aquifer in this case, is water levels that provide access to groundwater consistent with the operating plan over historic dry hydrologic periods, like for example, in the last drought of 2006 to 2016. So that's where we'd like to maintain water levels. Now here's a graphic that presents some of those concepts that I'm talking about. You'll notice on the left-hand side, we have elevation of the groundwater level. And this is in an existing alluvial observation well. So this is the elevation of the groundwater. And then across the bottom, you'll notice that there are dates starting from 1980 to 2020. That's our historical period. It includes historical wet and dry periods. And what we've done is that we've translated those forward in time and modeled that same climate and that same hydrology with climate change on top of that to look at what would happen to water levels in the alluvial aquifer at these individual points. And so using that analysis, we've picked In this red line, for example, this minimum threshold line, the lowest level that we consider to be within our sustainable range, that's our minimum threshold, or MT. You can see this purple line, that squiggly line, represents the predicted lowest water level out in the future in 2042. You see this green line represents an average level that we would expect to see in the alluvial aquifer. So this creates an operational range between the red and the green. We want to operate it closer to the green line. Now for the Saugus aquifer, this is an example of a well, an observation well in the deeper Saugus aquifer. Again, groundwater elevation on the left. We have time on the bottom scale, same kind of projection forward in time. So this date you see here, 2020, is actually in the future, out to 2042. And we've superimposed climate change on this as well, as we did in the previous analysis with the groundwater model. And you can see what those predicted water levels are doing here, as we've seen in the past with fluctuating climate, fluctuating pumping. We've picked the lowest level that we predict to occur in the year 2042 as our minimum threshold. And likewise, we've picked an average level here, the green line, as our measurable objective. That's where we'd like to kind of maintain water levels on an average basis. This just gives you a flavor for how we went about setting these thresholds or these criteria. Now for reduction of groundwater in storage, it's very similar to the groundwater level thresholds. The amount of water in storage is very much tied to water levels in the aquifers. So what we've said here is the minimum threshold is addressed by the what we've observed for, and same for measurable objectives for water level decline indicator. We want to make sure there's an adequate volume of groundwater in storage to get through extended drought periods. And for the Saugus formation, the deeper aquifer, that minimum threshold is considered an interim level at this point in time. It's subject to change in the future upon review and upon concurrence with the GSA, because it's possible, we believe it's possible to pump the Saugus more to provide resiliency during drought without causing undesirable results. The analysis we've done now uses the operating plan going forward in time with full build out of the basin and climate change. We don't see a chronic decline in water levels, so we know that based on the modeling results in the operating plan, we should be okay. Can we pump it, the Saugus, more? We may be able to, and that would have to be tested and evaluated. For measurable objective for the Saugus formation, again, it's tied very much to the minimum thresholds, measurable objectives for water level decline indicators. For subsidence, which is obviously an important issue whenever you talk about water levels that are going to go below what we've observed in the basin already. So we're establishing those based on a geotechnical evaluation that's still ongoing, considering local geology and what we predict to be future changes in groundwater levels with time. And so that minimum threshold is going to be a rate per year or per 5 years over our planning horizon. It's the maximum amount of subsidence that's allowable at critical infrastructure without causing damage. Our measurable objective is going to be, hey, we don't want long-term elevation changes, but we know we're in a basin that's affected by faulting and folding. It's tectonically active area. We know that there's places where actually are rising due to uplift. We know that there's oil extraction going on in some areas. So it's a complicated topic. Moving on to degradation of groundwater quality. This is an important one for everyone. So our minimum threshold for contaminants, and I've got a separate category for contaminants and a separate category for those salts or nutrients that I mentioned before. So for contaminants, including perchlorate, VOCs, PFAS, these are contaminants that most of you are familiar with that have been detected over many years in the basin. And these predate enactment of SGMA in January of 2015. So it's a responsibility for characterization, monitoring, remediation. That's being handled by the state Regional Water Quality Control Board and the California Department of Toxic Substances Control and other agencies. It's not the GSA's responsibility. Just to note here, SCV Water has proactively collaborated with the regulatory agencies over in past years. They're monitoring for contamination. They've installed wellhead treatment where necessary when those concentrations of contaminants are reaching regulatory thresholds. And because the GSA has no authority or responsibility for managing contamination, there's no minimum threshold for regulated contaminants that are in the plan. However, it's obvious that there would be a need to continue to collaborate and consult with the regulatory agencies on these matters. Now for the salts that I mentioned, salts and nutrients, including TDS, chloride, nitrate, sulfate. These constituents, these dissolved constituents typically are naturally occurring in many cases, and they also have regulatory thresholds. And so if we're saying in each of the representative wells, in 20% of those, we've set as kind of a threshold. If we stay below 20% of the wells in each of the management zones that are identified in that salt nutrient management plan, then we're above the minimum thresholds for salt and nutrients. This way we preserve capacity in the aquifer for implementation of, for example, a recycled water program. Now, measurable objectives. I got separate ones for contaminants and separate ones for the salts or nutrients. So for the contaminants, we're saying we'd like to maintain municipal pumping for beneficial uses consistent with the volumes that are presented in the urban water management plan for wet, normal, dry, and multiple dry years. We want to maintain non-municipal pumping. That's agriculture, golf courses, the Pitches Detention Center, the Whitaker Bromite, contaminant remediation, and small scale domestic pumping, consistent with volumes that are quantified in that, again, the urban water management plan for these wet, normal, dry, and very dry periods. Groundwater quality from private wells. The measurable objective there is we'd like to maintain those at or better than the basin plan objectives, the basic water quality standards for the basin that have been established by the Regional Water Quality Control Board and as verified by a groundwater monitoring program. Right now, we have limited data for private wells, so it's one of the things that we're going to be considering is looking to develop a database for those private and domestic wells that are out there. So for salts and nutrients, again, we're wanting to maintain concentrations of those constituents that meet or exceed basin water quality objectives that allow for this basin-wide assimilative capacity that's described in the salt and nutrient management plan for this basin. Moving on to interconnected surface water, places where groundwater and surface water are interconnected. So significant and unreasonable surface water depletion as a result of pumping has not been observed in the basin. We don't know of any surface water diversions. There's more water in the river now for in-stream or downstream users than in the past as a result of urbanization, importation of state water, discharge of treated water into the river from those imported sources and groundwater. Groundwater levels in wells downstream in the next basin downstream in Piru Basin are higher now as a result of urbanization and this additional water that's been discharged into the river. So our focus for this particular sustainability indicator is avoiding adverse impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems or sensitive aquatic species. We want to avoid these impacts, avoid significant and unreasonable impacts. For that reason, we've created what we call groundwater trigger levels. We've identified those in a specific set of monitoring wells that are within the GDE area. And we're planning to identify a specific evaluation process to determine what the cause of any particular decline is in that area, and try to assess what an action might be, a management action, to avoid permanent loss of habitat or acute impacts to aquatic species. That'll be spelled out in our monitoring that we're working on right now. So, as I mentioned, we're focusing on avoiding impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems. We've established these what are called action trigger levels. So these are the groundwater levels within the GDE areas. We've established that action level at the historic low level. And the assumption there is that the plants are adapted to water level fluctuation in the aquifer already, the alluvial aquifer. And so we just want, if we set the threshold at the historic low, then we know that if water levels are fluctuating above that, we should be fine. We should not have an impact to GDEs. If water levels drop below that historic level, then we have a potential for a concern. Now we have a sensitive habitat area, and for example, in the I-5 bridge area where we know we have the stickleback fish, we've set this intermediate trigger at about 2 feet above that historic low, just to give us time to respond if we start getting close to the historic low. We want to make sure that we ensure that the evaluation occurs in a timely manner, and any action that's taken to address that potential impact is timely as well. We're at this stage, based on feedback that we've received from the peer review panel that has been hired to review this work, we're taking a look at establishing an actual surface water flow criterion, a minimum threshold, as well as a groundwater level threshold for certain, particularly from certain areas of sensitive habitat. A measurable objective for this indicator, we're saying average future groundwater levels is a good threshold that don't result in permanent loss of habitat at our monitoring locations. And we want to maintain some observable flow in the river where UTS are present. We can't afford to let those pools dry up or let that flow disappear. So we'll be utilizing groundwater level data as a surrogate for measuring surface water flow in areas where we don't have stream gauge data. Some areas are going to be difficult to establish a gauge just because of the braided nature of the river in some of these locations. So we're going to use a combination of visual observation of river flow and also groundwater level data as a surrogate for helping us determine where the threshold ought to be, or where we've maintained appropriate flow in the river at those sensitive locations. So here are some considerations when triggers are reached in the GDE area. These are questions that we're going to be asking, that are going to be laid out in our monitoring plan for helping us evaluate, is this potential impact, is it significant and unreasonable? How imminent is it? So we're going to ask the question, is the affected river segment supported by surface flow from WRP discharges already? If it's being fed by surface flow, then it seems that even if groundwater levels drop, there's still water present to be supporting the habitat. Is the historic low groundwater level already below the tree, shrub, root zone depth in certain areas? This is particularly the case potentially on the fringes of the GDE area where we have a lot of fluctuation in groundwater levels, and in many cases, those levels might already be below a typical tree shrub rooting depth. Will the vegetation and sensitive species survive temporary loss of access to groundwater? Obviously, certain places that it likely won't be the case, and in other places, maybe there's more flexibility. You know, it's a very dynamic system and it's changing all the time. Has the management action trigger been reached often in recent years, and have water levels recovered quickly? So that gives us an indication of, how sensitive that area might be to groundwater levels. This is a key point. The GSA is, in this indicator specifically, is tied to are the declines in groundwater levels resulting from pumping. The GSA is not responsible for mitigating impacts caused by extended drought and climate change. However, if pumping is observed to be causing the problem, or if that's what's suspected, or if the GSA implements some kind of project or program that reduces flow in the river or reduces water levels, then that's an indication that something might need to be done and that the GSA has some responsibility there. For climate change, not the case, unless the GSA decides that. And then lastly, has new information been obtained that can be used to refine that trigger level? We expect as data are obtained, as we get more information about the relationship of groundwater levels and pumping with climate, we'll have a lot more knowledge to work from, and that's what that last bullet is intended to address. Bottom line, though, is that the GDEs are going to be very sensitive to the timing of when these potential impacts occur, and any management action would have to be implemented in a very timely manner, and those actions could include redistributing or reducing pumping in certain areas in order to protect GDEs. So I'm going to go over a few examples of what I mean by thresholds and these trigger levels for groundwater dependent ecosystems. This is a map that Tom Barnes' team from ESA put together. You can see the green area is the primary focus of what we're calling the GDE area. This is an area that after a lot of screening and looking at, for example, the species that are present and are they typically associated with groundwater, and likewise depth to groundwater. If areas that have groundwater deeper than 30 feet below ground surface, those are not typically supported by groundwater. So those have been clipped out of the potential GDE locations, and we ended up with this distribution you see here in green. And this is based on the highest water levels that we've seen in September, and this was in case was 2011, prior to the drought. This is a tentative GDE monitoring locations within the GDE area that you see. The dots that you see here are subject to change. We may move them around. We may need to move them to accommodate property access to avoid impacts to habitat, but also permission by property owners along the way. But it just gives you a flavor. We're talking about anywhere from 6 to 9 monitoring locations in different parts of the river, because the river's dynamic, it's gaining and losing in certain places. And so we need to understand what's going on in each of those places, including Castaic Creek tributary and San Francisco Canyon. This is an example of one of the monitoring locations tentatively. This is at the I-5 bridge. You can see on the map where that blue arrow is. And we have, for example, on this spot, you can see elevation on the left-hand side of the graph, and we have time on the bottom. And it's that same, historical climate projected forward in time with 2042 climate change and full build out of the basin. This is projected forward. But the key thing is that we're saying for GDEs, we want to set the minimum threshold at the historic level, historic low that those plant communities have seen. I think I misspoke when I talked about future projected. We're actually using historical water levels that either are measured or we predict with the calibrated groundwater model. You can see where the measurable objective up there is the green, but the trigger level that we want to use is that red line, the historic low. This is 2 miles downstream of the Valencia Water Reclamation Plant. A lot more fluctuation in water levels. We've again picked that lowest historical level as our threshold. Anything below that, we have a potential for an impact. We're nearing the end. So next steps, there's a stakeholder advisory committee meeting on March 24th. And we're going to discuss and consider input from this workshop. We'll take that input along with the input we get on the March 25th GSA meeting to update and refine the sustainable management criteria chapter of the GSP. There'll be other opportunities if you'd like more time to look at this. We're going to fold in the comments and fold in our responses. It'll be woven into the GSP document itself, which will also be out for public review later this summer. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Tara, are you back online?
That was easy.
Hi,
Hello.
how are you doing? Are we
Doing
good?
good.
Are we
I
good?
see you're in from your road trip, huh?
I am. I've been having a great time listening to what's going on in the world of sustainability and how we're going to address it moving forward. I did see some questions pop up that we're going to address, I'm sure, in terms of the levels. So are we into the Q&A section of our, or have we wrapped? I know you said we wrapped it, but like, are we done?
Yeah, the presentation's
Yeah.
over. We're happy to entertain questions.
I think we're ready.
So Stacy had the question about really the levels. So are we being told what the levels are going to be, or is the input going to be taken into consideration in terms of what the levels are? Because she would like to see the thresholds looked at again. She has some concerns about those levels being reached in 2016 and that there were impacts to the GDE with oaks dying and tributaries drying up. So
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'll take a shot at it. And Tom, I know Tom Barnes is on the call. He can certainly speak to this as well. So basically, we are using that historic low, which was during the last drought. We saw that most, if not all, the plant communities came back. There was some loss of some trees, but we also see a lot of recruitment going on, and we can speak to the resilient nature of the GDEs. I think that it's clear that, in our opinion, that impact was likely caused by climate, lack of recharge, lack of rainfall in the basin. But that issue is going to be looked at in the future. We've established these trigger levels to make sure that if we have something that's caused by an impact that's caused by pumping, that we can manage it. But if it's something that's likely caused by climate change or reduced rainfall, then that's not the responsibility of the GSA. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add a few things. Tom Barnes here with ESA. We prepared the analysis on GDEs. I think that we have responded to comments about concerns about the levels, particularly in the aquatic area where, as Jeff had pointed out, the drying up of pools is really unacceptable and caused by pumping or otherwise. And so having a sense of what's going on in that segment as an alert is a good idea, and we've incorporated that into the trigger levels for that area. Much of the rest of the river segments supported riparian corridor vegetation that is susceptible to drought conditions. And in this system, as we see in the whole system, as the eastern portion is quite dry, and the western portion is sustains some groundwater upwelling, sustains vegetation. it's sort of a tilted system, and water continues to drain out and drain downstream. And so when we are encountering unprecedented duration of drought, we're going to see some effects to the trees here and there, potentially the ones that are the most reliant on the deeper water, on farther from the table. What we've seen over time is the resilience of these systems, and that they respond. I really think that the hydrographs that Jeff showed, where you really see the seasonal changes in all of the hydrographs, where they drop down in some areas, they go up and down 2, 3, 4 feet. In other areas, they can go up to 10 or 15, 20 feet from a February to a September or something like that. So we really see how reliant on rainfall and just the infiltration for the whole watershed that these GDs and this system really relies on. So the thought that the triggers or the historic lows should maybe be looked at prior to the historic lows, and triggers are too low, is a fair comment, and I think we have responded to it for one area, and we're considering whether to do it in other areas as well. In any case, the management of the monitoring wells will provide that data to everybody, and so we can all be watching it. The management actions then and the evaluation process of how to how and when to take an action then will be deliberated by the GSA.
I would add further, Tom, that these levels are not going to be carved in stone. There are opportunities to update these thresholds and levels. If we see that we have these thresholds might be too deep based on what we observe, we can, we have the option, the GSA has the option to raise those levels in the future. There are 5-year updates to the GSP, for example. That could be an opportunity there.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jeff. I was going to mention that too. I mean, the way we've structured this is when we reach the historic low, which is the trigger, or as Tom mentioned, a couple feet above that in the upper section, we'll implement an evaluation to see, we'll look at the health of the GDEs, we'll look at the causes of the low water levels, and an outcome of that also is going to be determining if those triggers are appropriately set. And as Jeff said, those will be revised in the future when we get more information.
Yes, and Stacy, I think your questions are fair. And we are, for example, in the monitoring plan that's under development right now that you'll have an opportunity to review, we have structured the monitoring and also the frequency of monitoring and frequency of reporting to be very responsive to this issue. So it's not like a year's going to go by and then we see a bunch of dead trees. And there's going to be a frequent evaluation and monitoring element to this overall plan. And you'll see that in the next section that we're going to provide for review.
Yep. Yeah, and we will have another section available. Jeff, are we planning to release that monitoring program is it May? Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm blank, but it's coming, Stacy.
It's a draft of it is coming to the GSA staff this month, actually.
Yeah, it'll be this month.
We'll need to work through that and work through the comments, and I'm imagining that sometime in April it would be released for review.
Right.
And we'll be presenting it at one of these meetings. So a shot at it at that point as well.
Yeah, Stacy, the monitoring is really important, as Jeff said, because that's going to help us make sure that we understand what's happening with the groundwater dependent systems, and also help us understand if the thresholds are set where they need to be. So we're looking forward to getting data and some instrumentation in the field to help with that.
I might also add that we have been consulting with CDFW and getting their input. and considering their input on this as well. So
Mhm.
not doing this in a vacuum.
Right.
Okay, so one of Stacy's other questions was, who is the peer review panel? Because I think we haven't really talked about that, but I think that's a critical question part of this.
Okay. Jeff, I'll take it.
Okay.
Stacy, the peer review panel is a team of groundwater experts, groundwater modeling experts that's been assembled by Jacobs Engineering. And it's been something, getting the panel put together has been something that we've talked about for a while. It's up and running. It's providing preliminary input on what we're doing. You asked who. One of the members is Nate Brown with Jacobs. Another member is Jim Rumbaugh, who's over on the East Coast. He's a well-known expert in modeling and software. And another key member is Dr. Jason Sun, who's on staff at United Water Conservation District and working on the downstream groundwater sustainability plans. So it's an excellent team.
Sorry, I was muted. Stacy, does that address all of your questions? Stacy?
Oh, I wasn't
Your
aware that
screen.
I could unmute. I was typing it in the chat. I'm sorry. Yeah, it answers my questions for now. But my big concern, and I kind of said it in the chat, is that, you know, we have a committee that we discuss these things, but I don't see any of our concerns or considerations being adopted or even considered in these presentations. So I kind of feel like we're being dictated to rather than our input being given any sort of influence over the plan.
Well, we're certainly taking the input, Stacy, and as Jeff mentioned, we're in the process now where we're refining this. Tara, I don't know if you have anything else to say about that.
So one of the things that I noticed was particular to the East Basin, and I know that Jeff has done a lot more of the monitoring based on some of Sandra's concerns regarding the East Basin piece. Jeff, do you want to talk about that a little bit? I know that Sandra had a lot of concerns about not having any monitoring, and then we've actually done some of that kind of looking into that and looking into that a little bit deeper. And in fact, we looked at some of the animation and modeling within that cross section specifically to address some of those.
Yes, and we did talk about this in a previous meeting where we presented the hydrographs for that area to show that the groundwater levels were way below where we would expect GDEs to be able to develop water. And so it was further justification for the monitoring that we're planning within the GDE area. We let the vegetation kind of tell us where they're receiving water. And so that's what you see in the monitoring program. You know, as far as where the thresholds ought to be set, I know that was one discussion we had in the stakeholder advisory committee meeting. We are taking into consideration to establish some, I don't know what you call it, early warning thresholds above the minimum, above the initial trigger levels, so something above that to give us some time to respond prior to reaching the historic low. We've definitely taken that into consideration within the critical area, for example, where the stickleback fish live, that require a certain amount of flow in the river. And we're considering it elsewhere as well. We haven't made that decision yet, so it's not reflected specifically in the presentation that you see. I am kind of curious. I really do value the input, Stacy. So I'm wondering what other input that you feel was ignored. I want to.
I don't know if it's ignored specifically, but you know, we've talked extensively about the east end of the valley, both Sandra and myself, and I'm glad that you put the monitoring in there, but I didn't see any changes to the thresholds. I am concerned about some of the ambiguous numbers in 2042 and one presentation. I can't. I think it was. Was it, I can't remember if it was Portillo or not, but somebody said that climate change wasn't going to affect our water levels or something. And so I just kind of pull my hair out a little bit and I say, oh my God, of course it's going to affect our water levels. And so I just wanted to make sure that these things are being addressed and that these thresholds are looked at, because I believe that they are set too low.
Okay. And just so I'm clear, Stacy, you're talking about thresholds for the overall aquifers or just within the GDE area?
Within the GDE area specifically, but I think that we should look at it all along the basin.
Okay. Well, the GDE area, the thresholds are not based on future predicted water levels. I misspoke about that. They're based on what we have observed in the past historically or had predicted to have occurred in the past at specific locations. So climate definitely has an effect on groundwater levels, no doubt about it. When we investigated that elsewhere in the basin, whether you're talking about the Saugus Formation or in the alluvial aquifer outside of where the GDEs live, we basically found through our analysis that that aquifer can be pumped in accordance with the operating plan in the future with climate change, and we don't see a chronic decline in water levels. So we felt comfortable with setting the thresholds at where they were, first from a sustainability of supply point of view, at the predicted future low. Now that's a different question for the GDEs. And frankly, it may be that the GDE monitoring is going to somewhat dictate a little bit about where those thresholds end up. Because it's really, number one, trying to avoid the impacts to GDEs. It's just it's going to really drive, what thresholds we use.
Yeah, and Jeff, one thing to add is with the GDE areas, we're looking at these trigger levels that will help guide evaluation and response. The big picture, our minimum threshold for GDE is not to create die off or harm to the habitat from groundwater pumping, and that's a tall order, and but it's important. And so we've taken this approach with the trigger levels because there isn't a whole lot known yet about this riparian corridor. So we've taken the approach with the trigger levels and a monitoring and an evaluation program to make sure that the GDE areas are protected. So we can talk about whether or not the trigger is set where is set at the right level, but the big picture is we want to set it, we want to monitor it, and we want to make sure the GDEs are protected. And the other thing, and it's been said before today, but time is a factor, and I think you mentioned it, Stacy. We want to have these trigger levels set at a level that's high enough to where we see them and begin the evaluation in time to determine if any management actions are needed.
Stacy, were there any other comments from past meetings that you felt were not adequately addressed?
Jeff, I'm happy to take that offline with you. I've got some notes that I don't have in front of me, so I'd have to go back through my notes. And
Okay.
I'm happy to meet with you or whatever later on. And I don't want to take up the whole time.
Yeah, if you
Okay.
could send me your comments, because that's how they're supposed to kind of come through me, and then I record them
Oh,
all.
totally.
And I
Yeah,
have a
I'll do
record of
that too.
every comment that's been made so far, and so far most of them have either been addressed and or adjusted and or spoken to. So that's why this is such a major concern for us. So please, I actually have a transcript of the last meeting, so I'm trying to sift through that right now and see if there's something that we missed. I'm not
Okay.
seeing it. So that's why I'm very concerned about the fact that you feel that way. That's obviously never a place where we want to be coming from. So if you could send me those comments and I will absolutely make sure they are addressed, I would really, really appreciate it. And then they will also go into the record of the requests of comments and feedback, which we report, as you know, at every single SAC meeting, and
Yep.
then also at the board level.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll go back through my notes. I just didn't have them in front of me. I wasn't expecting the question, so I'll go back through.
Look
Thank
forward
you.
to
Thank you.
talking about it. You bet.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, and then so kind of moving into some other individuals' questions, and we'll get back to Stacy at the SAC wrap-up committee meeting and ensure that all her comments have been addressed at that meeting. Dan, you say it's important to distinguish the difference between pumping impacts and natural conditions on the east, and the GSA is intended to address the former and not the latter. So I think we made that clear already. I think Jeff already said that. So we're kind of, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to move on to Sandra's question, which is, are baselines open for adjustment when dates become available from the east? Data, sorry. I read it and then I read your correction. I apologize, Sandra. Are baselines open for adjustment when data becomes available from the east wells?
Yeah, I'll answer that question. Yes, absolutely. We know that we have a lack of information in certain locations. And as the monitoring plan is implemented, and we see that, in fact, our assumptions about how deep groundwater is were wrong, or if we think that plant communities actually are supported by groundwater, contrary to the analysis that we had previously, absolutely we'll make the adjustments.
That'll be a big part of what we do, Sandra, after the GSP is adopted and we begin the monitoring program. There will be effort moving forward year to year to make sure that these levels are set right. You know, the fact is we have data gaps. We're using the best available information that we have in a model, but revisions over time will be made, and that's totally consistent with the way DWR has set this process up.
All right, any additional, Sandra, does that answer your question first? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Type or talk? Thank you so much, Sandra. Are there any additional questions for today? All right, and I look forward to that either email or feel free to turn in that form, which I showed you, and I'll remind everyone just one more time. I'm gonna share my screen on the public workshop page. I'm gonna stop sharing your screen, Jeff. Continue.
Oh, yeah,
I'm taking it over. So again, public input is very important to us. So under public workshops, you can go to any one of the public workshops to submit your input, and you can put it in here or then submit away, and we'll get that and ensure that it gets to everyone.
Great.
Any final questions before we go off into the night? Thank you, Kathy, for posting the link. scvgsa.org. Don't forget. All right. I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you so much for attending. We
Thanks,
have a couple
everybody.
more of these. So
Yeah.
Everyone.
hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.